Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Pesachim Daf Ayin Dalid begins the 7th parak of the Masechta. We've concluded our discussion about the avoda of the Korban Pesach, and now we're discussing the roasting of the Korban Pesach. The Torah tells us in the Psukim that it has to be roasted in fire. That means not cooked in water, not roasted in metal, and not eaten raw. You have to make sure to get those three things accomplished. Also, it says that it should have its legs and its innards on it, which means it must be roasted together. The main parts of the animal plus the legs from the knee downward cut off, and the innards, these things should all be roasted together. So the Mishnah will begin by discussing how this is accomplished. So the Mishnah says as follows: is what you have to do. You have to bring a spit. The spit has to be made of a pomegranate tree wood, a spit of rima, and it has to be thrust through the animal from its mouth through to its rear opening. And then you have to hang it face down in the oven and roast it that way. Now, what do you do with the feet and the innards? So here you have a machlokas. So basically says you place it inside the animal and roast it all together. Rabbi Kiva says if you do that, the animal acts like a pot and it will cook the innards and the feet. So therefore you have to hang it near the animal on the outside of the animal. Now the Mishnah goes back to what type of spit you can use. So it says you cannot use a metal spit and you can't use a metal grill. And the Gemara interestingly brings an incident which seems to contradict this, and it says that Rav Gamliel told his servant named Tavi to go roast the Korban Pesach on a metal grill. Okay, the Gemara will explain on Daf Ayin Hey how that fits with the rest of the Mishnah. So the Gemara begins. And the Gemara first of all wants to know, why do you have to use a spit of wood, and why does it have to be a spit of rimon, of a pomegranate? So the Gemara first asks, why don't you bring a metal spit? The Gemara says you can't use that because the metal will get hot. Metal is very conductive of heat, and therefore if part of the metal is in the fire, the entire metal stick will get hot, and it'll end up roasting the flesh of the korban, which is in contact with it through its heat. That's not called roasting in fire, that's called roasting in metal. Okay, the Gemara says, fine, I understand why you can't use metal, but why can't you use a different type of wood? So why can't you use wood of a palm tree? The Gemara says that has ridges, and it's going to end up collecting water there, and it will cook parts of the korban. So the Gemara says use fig wood. The Gemara says fig wood is hollow, it's got a soft, moist inside filled with sap, and therefore liquid will seep out and end up cooking it. The Gemara says, so use oak, use a carob, or use a sycamore. You can't use any of these things because they have knots. You have to cut off the knots because it's not smooth, and in the place where there's a cut, liquid seeps out, and that'll end up cooking it. So Gemara says, well then how you use rimon? Rimon also has knots. Gemara says the knots of rimon are smooth, you don't have to cut them off, or you use a sapling that's just a year old, and therefore it doesn't have knots yet. Gemara says, but if you're worried about cuts, so when you cut off the branch or the trunk from the tree, there's a cut there, and then you get liquid on the korban there, and it'll cook it instead of roasting it. So Gemara says you make sure that the cut sticks out of the animal's mouth down to the ground, and therefore any liquid that seeps off there will drip straight out and is not going to have any impact on the korban itself. Okay, now the Gemara notes that this mission does not fit with Rabbi Yehuda. As Rabbi Yehuda holds, you're allowed to use a metal spit. He says, look, the wood that's inside the korban doesn't burn in the fire, right? The only wood that's outside the korban burns. Why? Because the korban itself, the animal, insulates the wood that is thrust through it. Same is true for the metal that's inside the animal will not get hot. The Gemara says, well, that the Chachamim disagree with that because they say, no, metal conducts heat. And therefore, if part of it gets hot, it'll heat the entire thing. Wood doesn't conduct heat. If part of it gets hot, the rest of it will stay cool. Okay, now, what do you do with the feet? So we had said that was a machlokas whether they go inside the feet and the innards. We had said that it's a machlokas whether they go inside the animal or near the animal. So the Gemara says that Rishmal called it tuch tuch. Tuch is the sound of a pot as it is boiling. It is also similar to the word tuch, which means inside. So he was saying that if you put it inside, it makes a boiling sound. It's like you're cooking it instead of roasting it. Rabbi Tarfon said, what you're supposed to do is have it outside on the spit, meaning you stick the spit through the animal, and the spit also runs through the legs and the innards, which are also draped or stuck on the same spit. And then he called it Gidimikos, a lamb with a helmet, because it's near the animal's head, and it seems to be sitting upon its head like it's wearing a helmet. So now the Gemara brings a brisa. What is the halacha is that today that we don't have a carbon, you're not allowed to eat roasted meat which looks like a carbon. So the brisa says, what type of meat, what type of roasting of a carbon, what type of roasting of a lamb will make it look like a carbon? So the Gemara says, when you roast it all together. But if you cut off one leg, or if you cook one leg, then it's not a problem. The Gemara says, hold on a second. If once you cut off the leg, it's not a problem already. Who cares if you cook it or you don't cook it? Why do you have to tell me that after you cut it off, you cook it? The Gemara says, no, when we said you cook one leg, we're talking about when it's still attached. It means that you cut off one leg, or you leave all the legs on and you cook one of the legs, then it's already not a problem because it doesn't qualify as a carbon, and therefore bisman hazeh, it doesn't look like a carbon, and it's not problematic. Okay. Now the Gemara goes into the halachos of salting. We know that you have to remove the blood of meat either via salting or roasting. Even when it is roasted, it does require a minimal amount of salting, much less than actual salting to remove the blood, because the roasting itself removes the blood, but it does require some salting. So the Gemara brings a statement of Rabbah, and the Gemara is going to try to bring a number of proofs or disproofs to it, one of which will be from our Mishnah. Rabbah said you're allowed to stuff an animal with meat. You're allowed to use, let's say, chopped meat to stuff an animal and fill it up, and then you could roast it that way, and then it becomes permitted, it's not a problem. And even if the meat that is used as the stuffing was not salted in any way beforehand, Machlokes Rishonim whether it has to be salted minimally as you would for roasting, or it doesn't have to be salted at all. So Gemara says that Abai asked Rabbah, how could you say that you're allowed to do that? But what the blood will drip out of this stuffing and it'll get absorbed in the animal. So he said no. The fire is strong enough, it'll draw the blood out of the stuffing and it'll also draw it out of the animal. Meaning when it gets absorbed by the animal, it'll actually absorb all the way through and come out the other side, and it'll drop into the fire. And you do not have any problem of the meat, of the blood being left inside the meat. It's gone already. So the Gemara says, let's see if we could find some proofs or kashas on Rabbah's halacha that you're allowed to have meat filled inside the animal and the blood draw straight out through the animal. First of all, our Mishnah would seem to be proof. Our Mishnah says you're allowed to put the innards and the legs inside the animal. Obviously, you don't have to worry about the blood. It'll draw straight out. The Mishnah says, no, that's different because the animal has its mouth facing the bottom of the spit. It's hanging straight down. Therefore, the blood can drip out through the mouth. But you do not see Rabbah's halacha that it can actually absorb out of the flesh and go straight through into the fire. Okay, the Gemara says, let's try another raya. The halacha is that when you want to eat a heart, an animal's heart, so it says you have to cut the heart, the flesh of the heart, in order to enhance the blood being drawn out. The Gemara is assuming, and this is referring to during roasting, but the halacha is, though, if you didn't cut it, but the evidence, okay, it's not a problem. So the Gemara says that would seem to indicate a proof that the heart, during the roasting, the blood gets all the way drawn out, even though there's liquid blood inside the cavities of the heart, and you're supposed to cut the heart in order to drain that liquid blood out. Even if you forgot to do that and it gets absorbed in the flesh of the heart, the fire will actually draw it out of the flesh of the heart, just like Rabbah is saying that the blood that comes out of the stuffed meat will draw out of the animal itself. The Mishnah says, no, this is different. This here has nothing to do with halacha of roasting fire drawing out blood, because here we're not even talking about where you're roasting the heart. We're even talking about where you're cooking the heart in water. It's not a problem, and the reason for this halacha is because the flesh of the heart is very smooth and is non-absorbent. And therefore this is a special heart halacha. This doesn't teach you anything about roasting, drawing blood through flesh. That's not what this is about over here. Now the Gemara brings another potential proof to Rabbah's halacha, and this is something that Ravan did. He took a bird and he wrapped it in a layer of dough, and he served it to Rav. And Rav said, if it tastes good, so then I'll eat some of the dough that's wrapped around it. Now, why don't you have the same problem of the blood being absorbed out of the animal and into the dough? Obviously, the fire that it's being roasted in pulls it straight out. So this is not necessarily a proof over there. The dough was very fine flour, and it makes a very crumbly dough, and therefore the blood flows straight through and goes out, but that doesn't prove anything about a situation like this where you don't have that. Okay, now the Gemara says that there's a story which seems to go against Rabba's halacha. Gemara says that Rabba went to the house of the Reish Galusa, and he also wrapped a goose in dough and he served it. And the Reish Galusa said, had I not seen that the dough that you wrapped it in is clear as white glass, I wouldn't eat it because I would be afraid it has blood in it. So the Gemara says, so you see, he has to see it. He's not trusting Rabba's halacha that the blood gets absorbed out, it gets pulled out of the outer layer by the fire. He wants to see for himself that there's no blood there. The Gemara answers over there, the flour was a different kind of flour. That's a flour that's absorbent. It's regular white flour, and it is absorbent, and therefore that's why it was problematic. But that doesn't necessarily prove against Rabba's halacha. Now the Gemara says the halacha is as follows: if it's fine flour, then even if it's reddened, it's okay. If it's white flour, then it has to be completely purely white and not have any streaks of red at all. If it is regular flour, all the types of flour, so then even if it has a slight redness, it's okay. But if it's completely red, then it becomes problematic. Referring back to the case of the meat that was stuffed inside an animal, the Gemara says, according to the opinion that that's permitted, it's okay even if the animal's mouth is not pointing downwards and the blood has to flow out through its walls. And according to one that it's forbidden even if the mouth is pointing downwards. The Gemara says that the halacha is that it is permitted. It's permitted even if the mouth is not pointing downwards. Okay, now the Gemara says there's a malchus between Rav Acha and Ravina about how you kasher from blood three types of things. That is meat that has a bruise, that has a reddish discoloration, that shows that there was a bruise there, that the blood collected. You have to get rid of that. Also, the testicles of a male animal and the blood vessels that carry a lot of blood. How do you kasher these things? These are all hard to kasher. So Gemara says the same machlokes between, in all three, it's a machlokes between Rav Acha and Ravina. Now the Gemara says, interestingly, there's often machlokes between Rav Acha and Ravina. We do not specify who says what. Well, in all of them, the halacha is lenient. The halacha is lekula. But in most of them, the lenient opinion is Ravina. In these three, the lenient opinion is Rav Acha, and the strict opinion is Ravina, although we still go leniently la halacha. Now, what is the machlokas here exactly in all these cases? So the Gemara says the halacha is as follows. If you cut them and salt them, that works. Meaning salting works, but you have to pre-cut these three things. If you roast them in a spit, then that's also good because the fire draws the blood out. The machlokas is if you put it on coals directly, is blood drawn out that way or not? And again, here the lenient opinion is Rav Acha, and we do pass like the lenient opinion that it is okay in all these three cases. The Gemara explains that the machlokas is when it's on the coals itself. Does the fire cause the flesh to contract and keep the blood in, or does it draw the blood actually out? Okay, now the Gemara says, what's the halacha about the liquid that drips out when you're roasting? So Gemara brings one opinion that says that it is forbidden if it's red. If you look at it and you see redness in it, then it's asur. If you don't see redness, then it's permitted. So Gemara says the Ravina disagrees, and he says there's definitely some blood in there somewhere, and it's forbidden even if you don't see any redness. The Gemara says that Mar bar Amemar either quoted his father's practice to Rav Ashi, or he told others about Rav Ashi did, that whoever it was would actually drink that liquid that flowed out, and therefore he held that it was permitted. You don't have to worry about blood being inside it. Okay, now the Gemara says that Marimar said to Rav Ashi, once on the subject of Marimar saying things to Rav Ashi, he said that my father would not reuse the vinegar that meat was soaked in. Vinegar was often used as part of the de-blooding process. The meat was often soaked in vinegar, so he said that if it was used once, he wouldn't use it again because the vinegar gets weakened. So he asked him, what's the difference between that and vinegar which is weak in the first place? If it's weak altogether, you don't say that you have to check the vinegar in advance and make sure that that's actually strong vinegar. So if it got weakened a little, why is it different than if it was weakened always? So Gemara says it's different because the even if it's weak vinegar, but the natural sharpness of the fruit is in there. On the other hand, if it is vinegar that was used already, the sharpness of the fruit is used up and doesn't serve the function.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.